it would be accurate to say Job is in a dungeon underneath a castle of despair. This is actually the nadir of his torment. This is the lowest of his lows. And if you read between the lines here in chapter 19, he's crying out for two things. The first is he needs to be heard. He longs to be heard. Turn to Psalms, which is just about a half an inch next door. Psalms chapter 116. Verse 2 says, because he, and the psalmist is talking about God here, because he has turned his ear to me, I will call out to him as long as I live. The imagery is God leaning down to listen to us. God hears us. God hears every single thing we say. He longs to listen to us. Job is desperate to be heard. The promise of redemptive narrative is that we are always heard. Even when it feels like you're crying in the dark, God is cupping his ear. The second thing Job cries for in Job 19 is to be held. You know, a lot of people will insist that to imagine God holding us is anthropomorphic. And anthropomorphic is just a $50 seminary word that means to ascribe human attributes to God or to something that is other than human. But it is not anthropomorphic to imagine God holding us. As a matter of fact, there are multiple examples of God holding us, holding his beloved in Scripture. Turn to John chapter 13. You're probably familiar with this story. If you grew up in church, you've probably heard it preached multiple times because this is the story of the Last Supper, that Passover meal that happened before the first Easter. And in this story, John is the youngest of the disciples at that supper. And in Jewish culture, the youngest at Passover meal was the one who asked most of the questions. And so John is asking a question here. And it says in verse 21 of John chapter 13, when Jesus had said this, he was troubled in his spirit, and he testified, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. The disciples started looking at each other, uncertain which one he was speaking about. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, doesn't it tickle you that that's how John describes himself? He says it 5 times in the gospel according to John, and I can just imagine the other 11 rolling their eyes. I'm the one he loved, I'm the one he loved. But anyway, I think John was able to say, I'm the one he loved because he leaned against Jesus. That's how he describes himself. He was reclining close beside Jesus. Verse 24, Simon Peter motioned to him to find out who it was he was talking about. So he, John, leaned back against Jesus, and as was customary of the youngest at the Passover dinner, he asked Jesus, who is it? Who is going to betray you? Most scholars and New Testament theologians think that John was about 13 or 14 years old at this point. He's probably the youngest of the disciples. He wrote the gospel according to John in his latter years. Again, most New Testament scholars think he was in his mid-60s when he wrote the gospel according to John. Head to the right to the end of his gospel account, John chapter 21. Verse 20, so Peter turned around and saw the disciple Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper. This is the end of John's gospel account, and as was customary in literature at this period of history, if you were writing a document and you wanted to assure its credibility, you would list what qualified you as an author at the end of the document. So at this point in the gospel according to John, it would have been appropriate according to culture and literary kind of style, for him to say, let me tell you what qualifies me to write this apostolic document. I have planted a whole bunch of churches. Thousands of people have come to Christ under my teaching. That would have been customary, that would have been common, but that's not how John defines himself at the end of this gospel account. He says, I'm the one who leaned against Jesus. 50 years earlier, or about that, was when he leaned against the breast of Jesus. He felt Jesus' chest expand when Jesus took a breath. And he was so close to him, and he felt Jesus' chest fall back down when he exhaled. That's how close he was to Jesus, and it defined him. It's not anthropomorphic for us to say God holds his children. If you study Scripture over and over and over again, God holds his children. I can tell you there have been times in the middle of the night when I have been so desperate to be held. And his arms may as well have been made of flesh because he held me. He's a father to the fatherless and a husband to the husbandless. And you better bet, in seasons of grief, he circles us with his affection. Jesus in the Gospel of Luke likens God to a mother hen encircling her chicks, putting his wings over us. God holds his children. That's his character. Job is desperate to be held. My gut says that's the cry of so many of us, isn't it? We need to be heard, and instead we settle for a few likes on Facebook. We need to be held. Instead we settle for a few pats on the back or a few kisses from enemies. Now we have got to run to God for our desperate need to be heard and to be held. Job is at the lowest point of his journey. He cries out to God, which is of course what we need to do. And the most beautiful triumph happens in this tragic moment, because this is when you get the verse that most people remember from Job. Job